Are software emulations of vintage EQ units worth the money, or are they just a massive rip-off? I was reading recently something about Pultec EQs and the number of emulations there are, and that got me to thinking, I wonder if you could do something like a Pultec EQ in your stock plugins in your DAW. Here's the Pultec from UAD. It's one of their new native plugins. Let's just turn it on. Down below here, I'll show you what this is in a second, but that's a EQ curve analyzer, and we'll just drop that down so we get that about 0. And this is a really interesting EQ because of the way the different parameters interact with each other. For example, this boost and this attenuation both use this low frequency value here, but if we look at the boost, for example, we're boosting at 60 Hertz there or 100 Hertz, but it's affecting frequencies all the way up to 3 kilohertz. And same with the attenuation, set to 100, but we're affecting things all the way up to, what's that, 10 kilohertz. So lots of interaction between these parameters here. Let's give us some nice soft EQ curves. Then the bandwidth, the boost and the high frequency knob here are all interactive. So the bandwidth increases the Q, but as you increase the Q, you decrease the gain. And then on the far right, we've got the attenuator and the attenuator frequency, and that's 5, 10 or 20 kilohertz. If we put that at 5, drop down and increase the attenuation, we get these nice, smooth looking, gentle curves. And just to show you what I'm doing at the bottom here, this is the Bertum EQ Curve Analyzer. It's a great little plugin, this. You can download it for free, but if you do download it, and I suggest you do just have a little play around actually. If you do download it, do send them $1 or $2 because it's a great little thing. But this is generating little pulses that are going through the channel EQ, and then we've got the EQ curve at the end, which is what we're looking at down here. But if I open the channel EQ, that's represented by this grey line here. So as I play with the channel EQ, we can see what's actually coming out. So this is measuring what's coming out. It's not showing you what it's meant to be doing, it's showing you what it's actually doing. So let's try and emulate this on the channel EQ. Now this can take a few minutes, and sometimes you can get it absolutely spot on, and sometimes you can't. Sometimes you might want to use, if you're trying to do this sort of thing, you might want to emulate it using a couple of EQs so that you've got enough frequency bands to do the various little wiggles, because hardware EQs, even though they've got similar parameters, just might work in slightly different ways, and the way that bands interact with each other is slightly different. I suppose that's the character of that EQ. We're getting close-ish here. I'm not going to do it perfectly. It takes a bit too much time. But for now, I think that's close enough to demonstrate that you can get pretty close, if not perfect. And just so you know, while I'm in this analyzer mode, you can't actually hear what's going through it because it's sending the little clicks. But we'll do something later to show you what everything sounds like. So it can be done, and in most cases, you can get really close. I'll take a look at a few more in a minute. The big difference isn't the sounds. The big difference is how you get to that sound and how you shape those tones. Got hardware EQ over there we'll take a look at in a minute, and that's pretty limited in the functions, but it's got a couple of little switches that do things instantly, and once you get to know it, it's a really fast way, a nice way of sculpting your tones. And I remember the very first time I went to get some vinyl mastered, and the guy pulled out the thinnest of frequencies on the kick drum to really make the transient pop, the thinnest little spike I'd ever seen on an EQ. But you've been able to do that on stock EQs for years now. But at the time, it felt like I'd just visited the future, which I guess I had in some ways, because it was completely different to any EQ I'd ever used before. And if you look at the Pultec again, it's a really broad brush character forming tool rather than a precision problem solver. And when folks were using live instruments through well-known mics in treated rooms, perhaps that level of precision we can get now wasn't necessary with no mad electronic screeches, or perhaps it just wasn't possible. But to create the same on a plugin, to generate those interdependencies that you get in a Pultec or with any hardware EQ, you're going to have to look at how each of the controls works with the others. Sometimes when you increase the Q, for example, you'll decrease the gain. On my Elysia over there, when I turn up the gain on the high frequency shelf, I reduce the gain on the low frequency shelf, but it just happens automatically. So it's a lot more complex than just, we've got something at 250 hertz, we're going to increase it by 10 dB with a Q of an octave. There's all sorts of different things to take into account. So here it is. This is my Elysia Xfilter. It's the only hardware EQ I use. It's a really nice bit of kit. Let me just take everything down to 0. So we take out the chain. Got 4 frequency bands. Got a low shelf, low mid, and high shelf. And these do what you might expect. Oh, let's put it on first. There's your low shelf. But then we've got some nice little tricks here. We've got this low cut. So this cuts the low frequencies. But as we increase the gain, we get that little bump around where we set the frequency. Also on the low mids, if we increase the low mids, we've got a low mid narrower Q. So we can play with those a little bit more. We don't have ultimate control over pretty much anything like you do in your DAW, but we've got things that are musically useful. So let's add some gain to the high or the high mids, narrow the Q on that. Let's add a little bit, add a little bit of gain to the higher frequencies, but look, it's doing things to everything as well. So if we increase those a little bit more, maybe let's add the high cut. So even playing with the gain, playing with the high frequency, we're still getting things happening in the lower ends. And then we've got this passive massage switch, and this gives us a little bump around 12K. So that's not affected by the frequency of the high end. That little bump's always where it is, basically. If we take all these out, play with this, that bump is always around 12K. But no matter what we do with this, we can always recreate it in Logic using Logic's standard stock channel EQ. This is sped up a fair bit. In total, it took me about 8 minutes to get this as bang on as I possibly could. But you can see that in the end, we do get there. We do get the same EQ curve. Over £1,000 then for the hardware versus 8 minutes on the software to get exactly the same curve. But of course, that's not how anybody would ever approach EQing anything. You don't try and create a curve, do you? You try and fit it in with your track. But what I was trying to show is on the hardware, I've got my little tricks that I use. There's the low pass and the high pass that you can just flick in and do things really quickly. But in Logic, of course, it's really flexible and you develop your own way of working in that as well. And just to double check that these curves sound like what they look like, although you should really be using your ears after all. Here I've matched Logic's EQ to the Elysia, and if I turn the Elysia on, we can see the green and the grey lines match up pretty well. So I've bounced down a track using the Logic's EQ and I've recorded it back into itself using the Elysia. Original's green, the Elysia's blue, and Logic's EQ is purple. And I'll put a link to these files in the description in case you want to have a little play with them yourself. And all this adds up to having almost ultimate control over the tone. You can sculpt it however you like, and you can sound like almost any bit of hardware out there just using your channel standard EQ. Of course, hardware can't do that. Hardware works within the constraints of size, of price, of components. And if you look at hardware or emulations of hardware, you'll see they all do it in a slightly different way. Here's the soft tube Summit Audio, and this is really broad brush stuff. We've got a low cut and a high cut. Then we've got 4 frequency bands. I suppose this is what they call a musical EQ because it's not too precise. It's just altering the sound in quite nice ways. supposedly. Here's Universal Audio's Manly Massive Passive. But just to show you this, because I thought this was quite interesting, the Manly Massive Passive, even when it's not doing anything, has a slight little incline or increase in the high end. If we turn it off, it's still got a little bump up there. If we turn the plugin off, it goes flat. Turn the plugin on, up there's a tiny little increase. Turn the plugin on, even though we're not doing anything, and we've got an increase. So just weird little things there that these plugins do. And I'm sure that's replicating what the hardware does. Anyway, on this, we've got low pass, in other words, a high cut, and a high pass, which is the low cut. Plus we've got 4 frequency bands, and we've got boost or cut, and they can be shelf or bell. If we take this off for a second and then put the shelf on the low one, let's put it on a boost, you get these really weird shapes from it. So from a straight up shelf, even though that's set at 470, which is around here somewhere, it's affecting frequencies all the way up there. And that's not straight, is it? And then if we change the shape of it, it does this little dip. Or if we set it to cut, it does the opposite. So again, a little bit like we had on the Elysia. So just things that would be difficult to recreate in Logic, but not impossible. Let's take that out for now. And what I've done here is I've just tried to match this boost with Logic's. Here's the curve I've put in with Logic, and if we look at this here, so if we use that as the underlay on this so we can see them both, it's perfectly matched. If I just change the frequency of this one, you can see the grey line there is Logic's EQ, the green line is the Manly. So perfectly matched. So now we'll take the analyzer out, and I've got the same track on both channels, but on one of the channels I've inverted the phase. So we should get nothing if they're perfectly out of phase. And what do we get? So we're going from 2, was that 2 dB, 1 dB to -18, -20. And if we look at what we're getting as an output, we're getting very little, which means they're very, very closely matched, but they're not identical. There are some little artifacts there. But if we listen to them, so practically identical, almost cancelling each other out. And just to show you what I'm doing there, if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say cancel them out, here's the same track. And what I've done here is I've inverted the phase of one of them. On mixing desks, you see a phase invert button all the time. And if we just zoom into these, into the waveforms, you'll see that when the orange one is dipping, the red one is rising. When the red one's rising, the orange one's dipping, etc., etc. So these completely cancel each other out. And when I play it, you don't hear a thing, but you can see both channels are going full whack. If I turn one of them off, and this is sort of how phase works as well. This is how EQs work. If I change the timing on that using Eventide Precision Timer line, you can bring it back in. But when it's perfectly inverted, you get absolutely nothing. So by doing that, you can hear the difference between the two channels. And I think you'll agree this is very, very slight between the Manly and the Logic EQ. And just to double check, trying that again with a Pultec. This has been sped up 10 times, by the way, and it's the EQ curve that we saw at the very start of the video when I was demoing the Pultec. And again, I'm copying it with Logic's EQ. Took a few minutes, but I got there almost exactly in the end. So we turn the analyzer off and just play these 2 tracks. We're getting very little out again. We're on -20 if we turn one of them off. Again, which shows we're getting really close results, but not perfect. And as I've said earlier, that's just not the way anyone would EQ anything. You don't try and copy a curve, you try and get things to fit into your track. So I don't think that's the point. The point of the hardware is that they've almost been filtered through many, many years and many, many ears to become classics, and that's why we're recreating them. And the classics, because they work well, they've got musical elements to them, the way the frequency bands interact with each other, how that works on pianos, guitars and drums, etc. There'll be thousands of them that were invented that never got as far as being produced because they weren't good enough or they weren't musical. So this way, using the hardware things isn't about necessarily I want to sound like a Pultec or I want to sound like a Summit. It's more about I know it's going to work, or it's a shortcut really to knowing that you're going to get, or hoping that you're going to get, a decent tone. But once you've used those emulations a few times, you start to understand what's happening. You start to understand how things sound when you use them, and you can emulate that without trying to emulate the curves. You just understand things a bit better. And I can't remember the last time I ever used anything other than Logic's standard stock EQ, and I don't know how many of those emulations I've got. I couldn't tell you how much money is spent on them. I don't think it's money wasted, because I think it's taught me various things. But at the end of it, I've been through that process. I understand what they do. I like what they do. I understand why they do those things. And now I just do them, or do all those little extra tricks in Logic, in the channel EQ. For me, it's just so instant. But I've not mentioned phase yet. I do realize there will be people screaming at the screen saying, you've not looked at phase. There's going to be differences when you look at the phase. So let's take a quick look at it. As far as I'm aware, most EQs use phase shifting in order to do the EQing. I'm not an electronics engineer, so don't pull me up on the details here. But like we did earlier, when we flip the phase of 2 signals, you can cancel them completely. If you just start shifting the phase, you can reduce the volume or you can increase the volume. So if you split a signal into 5 different bandwidths and you start changing with the phase on those different bandwidths, well, you've got yourself an EQ. So in fact, I think a lot of people think that EQing causes phase shifts, when in fact it's the other way around. The phase shifts create the EQ. So EQing is a side effect of phase shifting, but you do have to look at the phase shifting, especially when you've got multi-mic setups, because if you're putting different mics through different EQs and they're set up at different distances, well, you can get all sorts of phases and effects. Some of them you'll want, some of them might sound really good, some of them you don't, but you do have to consider it. Matching these 2 EQs again, they're identical. If we click on phase, we can see what the phase is doing. And this is this purple line down at the bottom. We can see the Manley drops when we get to about 20 kilohertz, whereas the Logic EQ comes back up to 0. So they are different, and I think this would be a different conversation if we were trying to match the phases as well and trying to do multi-mic setups, especially if you're looking at things like high pass. High pass just does all sorts of crazy stuff. It flips things by 180 degrees. And again, this can be really useful in some circumstances, but could Logic's EQ do something similar? Let's move this up, see when we get to it. It's doing something similar-ish, isn't it? Yeah, but not identical. And actually, while I was doing this little demo, it sort of shows quite how difficult it can be to replicate them. If I put this shelf on here, the shelf on the Manley does something completely different to the curve than you get on the Logic EQ. If I flip the Logic EQ ones on there and then play around with that, it just lifts the whole thing. So you can see how trying to match one to the other is pretty difficult sometimes, and maybe doing this that the Manley's doing is just a bit more musical. I don't know, but worth showing maybe. So you can't really hear that phase change on a track on its own. Maybe you can in extreme circumstances, or maybe people with magic ears can hear things happening between the low mids and the high mids, but it's not really something to worry about. And I'm not really going into it in too much detail here, because I think the majority of people that are using these EQs are using samples, they're using virtual instruments. Very few people will be using multi-mic setup. So that's a whole different video, really. That's a whole new lesson. So next up, we've got harmonic distortion. And this is something that all hardware will create, but you'll notice that the manufacturers will quote how small it is. It's not something to be proud of, but it is in there. So do these emulations reflect what the hardware is doing? Do they create the harmonic distortions, or is it just not a consideration at all? Let's take a quick look at that as well. Okay, so here I'm using Plugin Doctor to take a look at a couple of them. I've got the Manly Passive and the Pultec here. These are both from UAD. And this is sending out a pure sine wave at about 100 Hertz. And we can see what we're looking at here. We're looking at the Pultec. We've got harmonics at 200, 400, 600. So we've got all the even harmonics. If we add some boost, does that change? Yes, it does. So it's increasing different harmonic content as you play with the EQ. But these are really, really low. If we look at this, it's at minus 143 dB compared to minus 39. So we're getting 100 dB difference. To hear these things down here is the equivalent of trying to hear a pin drop in a Sex Pistols concert. But they are there, and if you've got more than just a simple sine wave going through, maybe you get more interesting things that you can actually hear if your original signal's got more harmonic content in the first place. And let's take a look at the Manly. Again, we can see things are happening. Little bits, oops. We've got a fair amount of distortion creeping in there. But again, this is 115 from 42. So it's like 60 dB difference, but you will possibly hear something, but it's very slight. And as I say, it's not something that a manufacturer will be proud of. You don't really want to add distortion when you're just playing with an EQ. But I imagine on things like this, you could well get some harmonic things that you might be able to hear. Unfortunately, with Plugin Doctor, you can't load in Logic's EQ. It has to be a VST or an AU file, which the stock plugins aren't. So I can't test it via that. But let's take a look at a couple of others. The Summit Audio and the Chandler Limited from Softtube. And I think the originals would be things that you would expect to get some rich harmonic content from. And you can see we are getting a fair amount. So this is the Summit Audio. Let's change the gain. Is it changing? So it's not really doing much as we change the gain or the bandwidth. Let's increase that to 100. So as we change that, there's minor things happening. Not quite as dramatic as they were with the Manly, but it is in there. And then looking at the curve bender, are things changing as we do this? Maybe very slightly. There you go. That's doing something there. So adding a fair amount of distortion there. There's an awful lot of harmonics in this one. So yeah, again, looking at the levels of that, that's at minus 116 compared to minus 46. So that's a 70 dB difference. So these are massive things that you can hear in a mix. It's not a distortion unit, but they are there. And if that's important to you, and if you can hear that in a complex mix, which probably can, there seems to be an awful lot going on there, it might add a little bit of magic sauce to your track, or you might not be able to hear anything whatsoever, depending on what you're sticking through it. So to go back to the very start and asking that question, are software emulations of hardware EQs a massive rip-off? Well, I don't think they're a massive rip-off. They do what they do. They do have to spend time looking at the interactions between the different parameters. They put the harmonic distortion in, and we saw the harmonic distortion changes on a lot of them, depending on the settings. So there's a lot going on in there, but is it worth it for you? That's a completely different question. If you've got a certain guitar or a certain amp and you're trying to do a certain tone, maybe the Pultecs and the Summits and the like, maybe they're just absolutely spot on to get an exact tone that you're after, and they'll do it much quicker than you can do faffing around trying to get things balanced in your Logic EQ, for example. But generally, you can do anything in your stock EQ that you can do in all the others. So if you're making electronic music, for example, or if you just want to get something done quickly, I've just found Logic EQ nowadays is the one that I always go to. I can't remember the last time I used one of my emulations. I think I've played with a few of the Softtube ones, just to have a play with them really. But if I'm trying to get something done, Logic, every time. It sounds great. It doesn't add all those harmonic distortions, but you can't hear them anyway. Phase changing, it's not an issue for me. I'm not trying to do anything that anyone's done in the past. I'm trying to do my own bits and bobs. So loads of things to think about there. I hope that answers the question without being too clickbaity, but it is a question that crops up an awful lot. So thanks for watching, thanks for staying to the very end. This channel is sponsored by YouTube ads, affiliate links, and my patrons. So do maybe, if you get a chance, take a look at my Patreon pages. There's samples, there's patches, there's various odds and sods on there that are quite useful. People quite like them, and it'll cost you less than the price of a lukewarm macchiato per month. And do also take a look at my starskycar.com website. Again, there's patches, there's samples, there's wavetables, there's stuff like that you can buy. And there's free stuff as well, but it's always nice, as I say, for people to pick up even some of the cheaper bits and bobs, because it all really does help to support the channel. Anyway, once again, thanks for staying to the very end. I hope you found that useful, and I will see you next time.